Sometimes the things the world throws away hold the most value. Sometimes what looks like a mistake becomes the greatest blessing of your life. Jebediah Stone spent his last $25 on a deed to scorched desert land that nobody else wanted, a fire-blackened wasteland with nothing but ash and bitter regret. Everyone said he was a fool, but on that desolate ground he found something nobody expected. A stubborn old donkey, abandoned and alone, who refused to leave. That donkey, whom he'd named Cinder, would do something extraordinary the very next morning, something that would transform worthless earth into the most valuable property for 50 miles. What did that donkey uncover in the burned ground that changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jebediah Stone had $47 to his name when he rode into Bitter Springs on a borrowed horse he'd have to return by sundown. 58 years old, with hands that still remembered how to work, but a heart that had forgotten why. He carried everything he owned in a worn leather saddlebag that had seen better decades. The bag itself told a story: scuffed corners, a broken buckle mended with wire, leather soft from years of handling. Inside, 2 shirts, a spare pair of socks with careful darning, a tin cup, a folding knife, a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes, and the deed to a small ranch that no longer existed. 3 years back, Jebediah had been a different man, ranch foreman for the Double T spread, married to Sarah Stone for 32 years, owner of a modest but paid-for piece of land where they'd planned to spend their final years, raising a few head of cattle and watching sunsets from their porch. Sarah used to say they'd earned their rest, that life owed them some peace after all the hard seasons they'd weathered together. She'd been making plans, talking about which vegetables would grow best in their garden, about maybe getting some chickens, about inviting their scattered children and grandchildren for holidays. Simple dreams, but real ones. Then the fever came through that winter. Started in the mining camps up north, spread like wildfire through the settlements. Sarah caught it helping their neighbors' sick children that was just like her, never could stand by when someone needed help. She fought it for 8 days. Jebediah sat by her bedside every hour he wasn't forced away, holding her hand, reading to her from the books she loved. On the 8th night, she squeezed his fingers once, smiled at him with those kind eyes, and slipped away so quietly he almost didn't notice the moment she left. The world had kept turning, but Jebediah couldn't figure out how to turn with it. He tried staying at the ranch, but every corner held her presence, her apron still hanging on its peg, her coffee cup on the shelf, the quilt she'd been sewing spread across their bed half finished. The silence was worse than any noise. After 6 months of walking through rooms that echoed with absence, he sold the place for less than it was worth. Didn't have the energy to haggle, didn't much care. He'd drifted since then, taking work where he could find it. Ranch hand, stable keeper, sometimes just odd jobs that paid enough for a meal and a place to sleep. The money from the ranch sale had seemed substantial at first, but it had a way of disappearing: medical bills he'd forgotten about, debts Sarah had quietly been managing, the cost of simply existing when you had no place to exist. 3 years of drifting had worn him down to those $47 and a saddlebag full of memories. Bitter Springs wasn't much of a town, maybe 200 souls if you counted generously. One main street of weathered buildings, a general store, a saloon, a land office that doubled as the telegraph station, and a scattering of houses that looked like they'd been dropped randomly by a careless hand. The kind of place people came through rather than came to. Jebediah had arrived because the man he'd been working for had paid him off here, and because he'd heard there might be a land auction. He wasn't sure why he cared about a land auction, wasn't sure he wanted to own anything again, to have something that could be lost. But Sarah's voice was in his head, her practical, steady voice that had guided him through rough patches for 3 decades. "Jeb," she used to say, "a man needs something to tend, something that depends on him, otherwise he just blows around like a tumbleweed. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe he was tired of blowing around. The land office was run by Earl Hutchins, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the permanently suspicious expression of someone who'd been cheated too many times. He looked up from his ledger when Jebediah entered, sized him up with one practiced glance. Dusty clothes, worn boots, the careful posture of a man conserving his resources. "Auctions at 3, Hutchins said without preamble. "Got 5 parcels going. Most are played-out mining claims, but there's one ranch foreclosure and a fire-damaged property. Cash only. No credit, no promises, no sob stories." "What's the fire-damaged one?" Jebediah asked. Hutchins pulled out a map, pointed to a section outlined in faded red ink. 40 acres, about 10 miles northwest, had a wildfire sweep through last summer. Previous owner fled, never came back. Bank took possession, wants it off their books. Fair warning place is thoroughly scorched. Nothing there but ash and disappointment. "What's the minimum bid?" $25. Hutchins shrugged. "Honestly, even that's generous. Land's worthless now. No structures, no water source that anyone knows of, just burned ground. But the bank wants something for it, rather than nothing. $25. That would leave him 22. Not enough to live on for long, but maybe enough to matter. "I'll be at the auction," Jebediah said. He spent the intervening hours at Molly Brennan's general store, which also served meals for those who could pay. Molly was a widow herself, maybe 10 years younger than Jebediah, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed very little. She served him coffee and a plate of beans without comment, but when he'd finished eating, she sat down across from him. "You're the one asking about the fire-damaged property," she said. "Not a question. Earl talks. Earl always talks." She studied him. "You know it's worthless, right? I'm not trying to discourage you, but that land is dead. Fire burned so hot it sterilized the soil. Even if you could afford to rebuild, there's nothing to build on." "Why do you care?" Jebediah asked, not unkindly. Molly was quiet for a moment. "My Tom, my late husband, he was like you, came through here 20 years ago with nothing but hope and determination. Bought himself some worthless land, made something of it through sheer stubbornness. I just recognized the look." She stood up. "Coffee's on the house. Good luck at the auction." The auction drew maybe 20 people, most of them there to watch rather than bid. The mining claims went quickly, men who knew what they were looking for, what traces of value might remain. The ranch foreclosure drew fierce bidding, finally selling for $340 to a wealthy rancher named Dutch Morrison, who owned most of the decent land in the county. Morrison was the kind of man who took up space even when sitting still. Broad-shouldered, expensively dressed, with a thick beard and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. When the auctioneer announced the fire-damaged property, Morrison snorted. "Waste of time," he said loudly. "That land couldn't grow weeds if you watered it with gold." "Starting bid is $25, the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 25? Jebediah raised his hand. The auctioneer looked surprised. $25 to the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 30? Silence. People were staring at Jebediah, some with pity, some with amusement, Morrison with something like contempt. "Going once at $25, the auctioneer said. "Going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back for $25. Just like that, Jebediah owned 40 acres of scorched earth. He settled the payment with Earl, who handed over the deed with the air of a man completing an unpleasant formality. Properties marked on the county map. There's an old trail that'll take you most of the way. After that, you'll know it when you see it, can't miss the burn scar." Jebediah returned the borrowed horse and set out on foot the next morning. He had $22 left, and the land office had given him a crude map. The trail was rough, more of a suggestion than an actual path, winding through scrub brush and rocky terrain that spoke of water scarcity and hard living. He walked through the afternoon and made camp that night under a sky so full of stars it seemed crowded. He thought about Sarah, wondered what she'd say about this purchase, probably something practical and kind, the way she always had. She'd been the sensible one, the one who could see 3 steps ahead, while Jebediah was still figuring out step 1. He missed her wisdom almost as much as her presence. The next morning, he continued walking. Around midday, the landscape changed. The scrub brush thinned, then disappeared. The ground turned dark, not the brown-grey of normal soil, but the deep black of complete combustion. He'd reached the burn scar. It was worse than he'd imagined. 40 acres of absolute devastation. The fire had consumed everything organic, leaving behind a landscape of ash and carbonized remnants. A few skeletal trees stood like monuments to the dead, their branches gone, their trunks blackened and cracked. The ground crunched under his boots, releasing small puffs of ash with each step. The silence was profound. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through grass because there was no grass to rustle. Jebediah stood at the edge of his property and felt the weight of his mistake. Earl had been right. Molly had been right. This land was dead, and he'd spent $25 of his last $47 to own it. Then he saw the donkey. She stood in the middle of the devastation, maybe 100 yards away, a grey donkey, medium-sized, her coat covered in soot and ash. She was thin ribs visible beneath her dusty hide, but standing upright, alert. She was watching him. Jebediah walked toward her slowly. She didn't run, just kept watching with large, dark eyes that seemed impossibly expressive. As he got closer, he could see she'd been there a while. Her hooves had worn paths through the ash to harder ground beneath. Near where she stood, the earth had been disturbed, places where she'd been digging, searching for anything edible. "Hey there," Jebediah said softly. "What are you doing out here, girl?" The donkey flicked her ears but didn't move. Up close, he could see she was old grey around her muzzle, a certain careful way of standing that spoke of long years. Someone had abandoned her here, left her on this dead land to fend for herself. The anger that rose in Jebediah was surprising in its intensity. He'd been numb for so long that feeling anything sharp was almost painful. What kind of person left an animal to die slowly in a place like this? He opened his saddlebag and pulled out the jerky he'd been saving for supper, broke off a piece, held it out. The donkey's nostrils flared. She took 2 careful steps forward, stretched her neck, and gently took the jerky from his palm. Her teeth were worn, but her mouth was soft, careful not to catch his fingers. "You've been alone a while, haven't you?" Jebediah said. "Well, so have I." He gave her the rest of the jerky, then poured water from his canteen into his tin cup. She drank it in 3 long draughts, then looked at him expectantly. "That's all I've got," he told her, "but I'll figure something out. Can't leave you here any more than I can leave myself here." He made camp as the sun set, choosing a spot near where the donkey had been standing. There was no wood for a fire. Everything combustible had been consumed months ago. He spread his bedroll on the ash-covered ground, lay down, and stared at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. The donkey stood nearby, a solid presence in the emptiness. Occasionally she'd shift her weight or flick her tail, but mostly she just stood there, watching over him like some kind of ash-covered guardian angel. Jebediah closed his eyes and thought about the choices that had led him here. A $25 purchase that had seemed desperate at the time now seemed outright foolish. 40 acres of land that couldn't support a single blade of grass, let alone a life. And an abandoned donkey who probably wouldn't survive another month without help. But as he drifted towards sleep, he realized something had shifted. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what was right in front of him. A problem to solve, a creature that depended on him, a piece of ground that was his to tend, however barren it might be. Sarah had been right. A man needed something to tend, even if it was just scorched earth and a stubborn old donkey. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning that makes the desert feel honest about what it is, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. Jebediah woke to a rhythmic scraping sound, a persistent scratching that pulled him up from dreams he couldn't quite remember. He sat up, his back complaining about a night spent on hard ground, and looked for the source of the noise. The donkey was digging. Not the casual pawing of a bored animal, but focused, determined digging. Her front hooves struck the ground in rapid succession, sending up clouds of ash and darker soil. She was working at a spot about 30 feet from where Jebediah had slept, near the base of what had once been a mesquite tree. The tree was dead now, just a blackened trunk, maybe 8 feet tall, but the donkey had chosen this spot with clear intention. "What are you after, girl?" Jebediah stood, brushed ash from his clothes, and walked over to her. The donkey paused long enough to look at him, then immediately returned to digging. Her nostrils flared with effort, her ears pinned back with concentration. This wasn't random behavior. She was looking for something specific. Jebediah knelt beside her excavation. The donkey had already dug down maybe 6 inches, past the layer of ash and into harder packed earth beneath. He could see scratch marks from her hooves, the disturbed soil arranged in a rough circle about 2 feet across. "Easy now," he said, reaching out to stop her. "You'll hurt yourself." The donkey pulled back from his touch but didn't stop digging. If anything, she intensified her efforts, her breathing growing heavier. There was something almost frantic in her movements now, as if time were running out. Then Jebediah heard it. A sound different from soil and ash, a metallic scrape, brief but unmistakable. The donkey's hoof had struck something solid. "Hold on," Jebediah said, his heart suddenly beating faster. "Hold on, now." He moved the donkey gently aside. She resisted at first, but finally stepped back, watching him with those large, expressive eyes. He knelt in the hole she'd created and began digging with his hands, pushing aside the loose soil and ash. His fingers found the edge of something hard and flat. He cleared more dirt away, working carefully now, feeling the shape of it. Metal, definitely metal, and it was big. Jebediah worked faster, widening the excavation, following the edges of whatever the donkey had found. After 15 minutes of digging, he'd exposed enough to understand what he was looking at. A well cap, old iron, rusted but intact, maybe 3 feet in diameter. It had been buried under 6 inches of ash and wind-blown soil, completely hidden from view. If the donkey hadn't known exactly where to dig, he never would have found it. Could have walked over this spot 100 times and never known it was there. His hands were shaking as he cleared the last of the debris away from the cap. There were marks on it, iron handles on opposite sides, and something stamped into the metal itself. He wiped away the rust and grime, revealing numbers. 1,867. This well was nearly 20 years old. "How did you know?" he asked the donkey. "How did you know it was here?" She just stood there, watching him with an expression that might have been satisfaction if donkeys could look satisfied. The ash that covered her coat made her look like she'd been forged from the burned earth itself, grey and sooty, a creature of cinders and determination. "That's what I'll call you," Jebediah said. "Cinder, you're a donkey made of ash and stubbornness." Cinder flicked her ears as if acknowledging her new name, then took 2 steps closer to the well cap and lowered her head, sniffing at it intently. Jebediah gripped one of the iron handles and pulled. The cap didn't budge. 20 years of rust and settling had welded it to its frame. He braced his feet, used both hands, pulled with everything he had. Still nothing. He sat back, breathing hard, and studied the problem. The cap was heavy, probably 200 pounds of solid iron. Even when new, it would have taken 2 men to lift it. Rusted in place, it might as well have been part of the earth. Cinder moved closer. Positioning herself near the well cap, she lowered her head and pushed at it with her nose, then looked at Jebediah expectantly. "You want to help?" he asked. She pushed at the cap again, more insistently this time. Jebediah looked at her, looked at the cap, and made a decision. He found a piece of burned wood that was still solid part of a fence post, maybe, and wedged it under the edge of the cap. Using the post as a lever, he pushed down hard. The cap lifted slightly, maybe half an inch, and he heard the crack of breaking rust. "Again," he said to Cinder, though he wasn't sure she understood, but she did. As he levered the cap up, Cinder pushed against it with her shoulder, adding her weight to his effort. The cap lifted another inch, more rust breaking free. They worked together for 10 minutes, Jebediah prying, Cinder pushing, both of them grunting with effort. Finally, with a grinding shriek of metal on metal, the cap broke free. Jebediah got his hands under the edge and lifted, muscles straining. Cinder pushed from her side. Together, they slid the heavy iron disc aside, revealing the dark shaft beneath. Jebediah knelt at the edge and looked down. The well was deep, he couldn't see the bottom, just darkness descending into the earth. The opening was lined with mortared stone, the work of someone who'd known what they were doing. This wasn't some hastily dug hole. This was proper construction, built to last. He picked up a stone the size of his fist and dropped it into the darkness, counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, splash. The sound echoed up from below, clear and unmistakable. Water. There was water down there. Jebediah sat back on his heels, his mind reeling. The fire that had scorched this land, the disaster that had made it worthless, had actually revealed its greatest asset. The well had been here all along, hidden under brush and scrub that the fire had completely consumed. The previous owners must have fled during the blaze, never coming back to discover what remained. "Water," he said aloud, testing the word. "There's water." Cinder made a soft braying sound, almost like satisfaction, and came to stand beside him. She looked down into the well, then at Jebediah, then back at the well. "You knew," Jebediah said, wonder in his voice. "You knew it was here the whole time. That's why you stayed. That's why you wouldn't leave." He reached out and stroked her dusty neck. Her coat was rough under his palm, covered in ash and grime, but solid and real. This donkey had been abandoned on scorched earth, left to die, and she'd survived by knowing what others had forgotten. She'd been standing guard over the well, waiting. And now she'd shown him. Jebediah stood and walked around the well opening, his mind already working through the problems ahead. The well was deep at least 60 feet, maybe more. He'd need rope to lower a bucket. He'd need the bucket itself. Probably need to repair the pulley system, if there even was one. The shaft might need cleaning, debris from the fire could have fallen in. All of that required supplies. Money he mostly didn't have. He looked at Cinder, at the well, at the scorched land surrounding them. 24 hours ago, he'd owned 40 acres of worthless ash. Now he owned 40 acres with water, possibly the only reliable water source for miles around. In this dry country, water meant everything. It meant life, trade, value, future. It meant hope. "I need to go back to town," he told Cinder. "Need to get supplies, rope, a bucket. Can't access this water without them." Cinder watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "I'll come back," Jebediah promised. "I'm not leaving you here. We found this together, and whatever happens next, we'll face it together." He gathered his few belongings, took one long look at the uncovered well, and started walking back toward Bitter Springs. Behind him, Cinder brayed once, not a distressed sound, but something almost like encouragement. Jebediah smiled for the first time in 3 years. He was still a man with $22 to his name, still a widower with more past than future, still walking across unforgiving country with everything he owned in a worn leather saddlebag. But now he had something else, too. He had possibility. The walk back to Bitter Springs gave Jebediah plenty of time to think, and thinking led him straight into the hard mathematics of his situation. He had $22. A good rope, long enough to reach 60 feet down and strong enough to haul water, would cost at least $8. A sturdy bucket, another 3 or 4. Tools to repair whatever pulley system might still exist if he was lucky, $5 more. That put him at $16 to $17 minimum, leaving him maybe $5 for food and basic supplies. $5 wouldn't last long, wouldn't buy feed for Cinder, wouldn't cover the cost of materials if he needed to rebuild any part of the well system, wouldn't give him any buffer for unexpected problems. And problems were always unexpected. He reached into his pocket and felt the small weight there. Sarah's wedding band, warm from being close to his body. 14-carat gold. A simple design but quality work. He'd saved for 6 months to buy it before their wedding, had been so proud to slip it on her finger. After she died, he'd taken it from her still hand, couldn't bear the thought of burying it with her, couldn't bear the thought of being without the last physical piece of their marriage. The band would fetch $40 easily, maybe 50 from the right buyer, enough to solve his immediate problems and then some. His fingers closed around it, and he felt the familiar stab of grief mixed with something new guilt. Would selling it be a betrayal? Or would keeping it while starving himself and Cinder be the real betrayal of everything Sarah had believed in? She'd been practical, above all else. She'd have told him a ring was just metal, that the love it represented couldn't be sold or lost. But knowing what she'd say and feeling okay about doing it were different things. He was still wrestling with the question when he reached Bitter Springs 3 hours later. Cinder had followed him the entire way, maintaining a steady pace about 20 feet behind. When he'd stopped to rest, she'd stopped. When he'd shared the last of his water, she'd drunk gratefully. Now she stood beside him on the main street, her ash-covered coat drawing curious looks from the handful of people moving about their business. Molly's general store was quiet in the afternoon heat. A bell jangled as Jebediah pushed through the door, Cinder waiting outside with the patience of someone accustomed to being left behind. Molly looked up from her accounts, and her eyes widened slightly. "You came back," she said. "Didn't expect to see you again." "Need supplies," Jebediah said. "Rope, bucket, tools." "For the scorched land?" "For the well on the scorched land." Molly set down her pen, hidden under the ash and debris. The fire burned away all the brush that was covering it. "There's water down there, good water, from what I can tell." "Well," Molly leaned back, studying him with new interest. "That changes things, doesn't it?" The door opened behind Jebediah, bringing with it a draught of hot air and the presence of Dutch Morrison. The man filled the doorway, his expensive boots loud on the wooden floor as he entered. 2 other men followed him, hired hands, by the look of them, the kind who did whatever Dutch needed doing without asking too many questions. "Did I hear something about a well?" Dutch asked, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone used to being the most important person in any room. Molly's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Private conversation, Dutch." "On my way to being a public matter, sounds like." Dutch turned to Jebediah, giving him the same calculating assessment he'd shown at the auction. "You're the fool who bought the burned property." "I'm the man who owns it," Jebediah said evenly. "And now you're saying there's water? Seems like information that might have affected the bidding. Didn't know about it during the bidding, found it this morning." "Convenient." Dutch walked closer, close enough that Jebediah could smell the pomade in his beard. "Tell you what, friend, you're in a tough spot. You've got land with a well, but no way to access that well without money you don't have. I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you $100 for the property. That's 4 times what you paid. And you walk away with a profit. Not interested. 125 then. Final offer." Dutch's tone had lost its friendly edge. "Property's not for sale." Dutch was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as if chewing over this unexpected resistance. "You're making a mistake. That well needs work, needs equipment, needs money. You've got none of those things. You'll end up losing it anyway, might as well get something out of it now." "Appreciate the concern," Jebediah said, "but no." Dutch's eyes hardened. He looked at Molly. "You extending him credit? Not your business what I do with my store, Dutch." "Everything in this town is my business." He turned back to Jebediah. "Think about my offer. Out here a man can have all the rights in the world and still lose everything if he's not careful. Accidents happen, wells collapse, things catch fire." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Think about it." He walked out, his men following like shadows. The bell jangled again, seeming too cheerful for the tension left behind. Molly let out a breath. "That's Dutch Morrison. You've just made an enemy. Seems like I didn't have much choice in the matter." "No," Molly agreed. I suppose you didn't. She pulled a ledger from under her counter, opened it to a fresh page. My late husband Tom, he came through here 23 years ago with nothing but determination and debts. I extended him credit when nobody else would. He paid back every penny, and we built a good life together before the consumption took him. She looked up at Jebediah. I see something of Tom in you. Maybe I'm a fool, but I'm willing to take the chance. Tell me what you need, and we'll work out a payment plan. Jebediah felt his throat tighten. That's generous. It's practical. You get that well working, this town benefits. Water out there means a reliable stop for freight wagons, maybe even a way station eventually. That brings trade, and trade is good for everyone. She picked up her pen. So what do you need? 60 feet of good rope, a bucket, pulley hardware if you have it, some basic tools, hammer, nails, saw, and feed for the donkey. Molly wrote it down. Call it $45 total. You pay me back when you can. No interest for the first 6 months. After that, we'll talk. Fair? Jebediah reached into his pocket, pulled out his remaining $22. This is what I have now. It's a start. Molly took the money, made a notation in her ledger. Let me get your supplies together. While she worked, Jebediah watched through the window as Dutch Morrison stood across the street, talking to his men. Dutch was looking at the general store, his expression unreadable from this distance. One of his men nodded and walked toward the livery stable. Jebediah turned away from the window. Whatever Dutch was planning, it would keep. Right now, he had supplies to gather and a well to restore. Molly helped him load everything into a borrowed handcart. She insisted on the loan, said he could return it whenever. The rope was new manila hemp, thick and strong. The bucket was galvanized steel, would last for years. She'd even thrown in a few pounds of oats for Cinder, who was waiting patiently outside. One more thing, Molly said, reaching under the counter. She pulled out a leather bag, heavy with nails and fittings. Tom's old carpentry kit. I've been holding on to it, but he'd want it used. Consider it part of the deal, Molly. Don't argue with me, Jebediah Stone. Get that well working, and watch yourself around Dutch. He doesn't take kindly to people standing up to him. Jebediah shook her hand, finding it strong and calloused, the hand of someone who'd worked hard for everything she had. I'll pay you back, every penny. I know you will, she said. Now go. Daylight's burning. He loaded the supplies onto the handcart, clicked his tongue at Cinder, and started the long walk back to his scorched acres. The donkey walked beside the cart, as if she'd been doing it her whole life, occasionally sniffing at the bag of oats. Behind them, Dutch Morrison watched from across the street, his expression thoughtful and cold. The return journey took longer with the loaded handcart, but Jebediah didn't mind. Every mile brought him closer to work that mattered, to a purpose he could see and touch. Cinder walked steadily beside him, occasionally bumping his arm with her nose as if to encourage him. The afternoon stretched toward evening, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. They reached the property as the sun touched the horizon. The well opening looked different now, not just a hole in the ground, but a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Jebediah unloaded his supplies carefully, organizing everything within reach. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But first, he fed Cinder, poured a generous measure of oats into Tom Brennan's borrowed bucket, set it where she could reach. She ate with the deliberate care of an animal who'd learned not to waste anything, and Jebediah found himself smiling at the sound of her steady chewing. Dawn came early, and Jebediah came with it. He'd slept lightly, half expecting problems that never materialized. Now, in the cool morning air, he studied the well with fresh eyes. The opening was clear, but he needed to see what lay beneath. He tied a loop in one end of the rope, lit a small piece of cloth wrapped around a stick, a makeshift torch, and lowered it carefully into the darkness. As the light descended, it revealed something unexpected. About 15 feet down, there was a wooden platform built into the stone walls, the remnants of a pulley system. Jebediah peered closer. The wood was fire-damaged and wouldn't hold weight anymore, but the iron fittings were still intact, and something was wedged between the platform and the wall. He spent the next hour rigging away to descend safely, testing the rope, securing it to the sturdiest nearby anchor point, which turned out to be the burned mesquite stump. Cinder watched the entire process with what seemed like skepticism, braying once when he first started lowering himself into the darkness. "I know what I'm doing," he called up to her, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. The descent was nerve-wracking, hand over hand, boots braced against the stone walls. But the well was solidly constructed, the mortared stones still tight after nearly 20 years. At the platform level, he found what he'd seen from above, a hand-carved pulley wheel, beautifully made from what looked like oak. The fire had scorched it, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable, smooth curves, precisely balanced, with an iron axle that still turned freely. Someone had loved this well, had built it with care and skill, intending it to last for generations. Jebediah worked the pulley free carefully, protecting it from further damage. As he did, he noticed something else carved into the stone wall beside the platform, barely visible in the dim light filtering from above. Mueller, 1867. The name of the family who'd built this place, who'd claimed this land, found this water, built this well with their own hands, who'd fled the fire and never returned. Jebediah climbed back up, muscles burning from the effort, and examined the pulley in full daylight. The wood was damaged, but could be restored. The mechanism itself was sound. With some work, he could rebuild the system using this original piece, connecting him to the people who'd first tamed this harsh ground. The next 3 days blurred together in a rhythm of physical labor. Jebediah worked from dawn until his hands couldn't hold tools anymore, then started again the next morning. He cleared debris from the well, reinforced weak sections of the stone lining, rebuilt the pulley system using the hand-carved wheel and new rope. Tom Brennan's carpentry tools proved invaluable: a good hammer, sharp saw, sturdy nails. Cinder helped in ways that surprised him. She learned to stand precisely where he needed her for counterweight when he was lowering heavy materials. She'd bray a warning if she heard or saw something he'd missed while focused on his work. At night, she stood watch while he slept, her ears constantly moving, monitoring the darkness. They developed a partnership built on mutual dependence and something that felt remarkably like friendship. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Jebediah attached the bucket to the rope for the first time, lowered it into the well, and felt the weight change as it broke the water's surface far below. He raised it slowly, careful not to spill, and when the bucket emerged into sunlight, it was full of water that caught the light like liquid silver. He set the bucket down, his hands shaking slightly, crystal clear, cold from the depths, no smell or discoloration. He dipped his fingers in, tasted it. Perfect. Sweet and clean, the kind of water men would travel miles to find. Jebediah poured some into his canteen, then tipped the bucket so Cinder could drink. She did, eagerly, the first fresh water she'd probably tasted in months. When she'd had her fill, she raised her head and looked at him with an expression he could only interpret as gratitude. That evening, as the desert cooled and stars began appearing in the vast sky, Jebediah sat with his back against the mesquite stump, Cinder lying nearby in the dust. He'd shared his supper with her, beans and hardtack, nothing fancy, but it felt right to share what he had. "My wife's name was Sarah," he said aloud. Cinder's ears swiveled toward him. "She died 3 years ago. Fever took her. I've been drifting ever since, feeling like scorched earth myself, burned out, used up, worthless." He paused, listening to the desert sounds, wind moving across the open ground, the distant cry of a hawk, his own breathing. "Then I bought this place. Everyone thought I was a fool. Maybe I was, but you were here waiting, weren't you? You knew what this land held. You wouldn't give up on it, even when everyone else had." Cinder shifted, moving closer until she was within arm's reach. "Sarah used to say that giving up was the only real failure, that as long as you kept trying, kept caring, you hadn't lost. I'd forgotten that, but you reminded me. He reached out, stroked her dusty neck. Thank you for that. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful moment. Jebediah stood quickly, his hand instinctively going to where Tom Brennan's revolver rested in his belt. Cinder scrambled to her feet, ears pinned back, the whites of her eyes showing. 3 riders emerged from the dusk Dutch Morrison, flanked by 2 hired men. They stopped 30 feet away, Dutch's expensive saddle creaking as he shifted his weight. "Evening, Stone," Dutch called. "Came to see if you'd reconsidered my offer." "Haven't and won't." Dutch dismounted, his men staying mounted. He walked closer, looking at the well, the rebuilt pulley system, the evidence of Jebediah's work. "I have." "That's good work. Impressive, even." Dutch's tone was conversational, almost friendly. "Makes the property worth even more than I thought. I'll go to $200. That's 8 times what you paid just 2 weeks ago." "Not for sale." "Stone," Dutch's voice hardened, "you need to understand something. There are legalities around water rights. Questions about whether someone can just buy land and claim all the water under it, especially when that water might extend under neighboring properties. The well is on my land. I have the deed. Deeds can be challenged, boundaries can be disputed, fire damage changes things, might have shifted property lines, made old surveys invalid." Dutch smiled, but his eyes were cold. "Legal battles are expensive, Stone. Drain a man dry faster than any drought. Might be simpler to just take my offer and walk away while you still can." Cinder brayed loudly, a harsh, aggressive sound. She moved between Jebediah and Dutch, her body language clear. She didn't trust this man and didn't want him near her person. Dutch's men's horses shifted nervously at the sound. Dutch himself took an involuntary step back before catching himself. "That's an unfriendly animal," Dutch said. "She's a good judge of character," Jebediah replied. Dutch's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake. Men have lost more than land out here when they didn't know their place. Think about that." He remounted, yanked his horse's head around harder than necessary. "I'll give you 3 days to reconsider. After that, I can't guarantee your safety or your properties." He spurred his horse, and the 3 riders disappeared into the gathering darkness. Cinder stayed tense until they were gone, then gradually relaxed. She moved close to Jebediah, pressing against his side. "He's not going to give up," Jebediah said quietly. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." But as he looked at the well, at the water they'd worked so hard to access, at the partnership he'd built with an ash-covered donkey on land everyone else had given up on, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not fear, not resignation, determination. This land had given him back his purpose. Cinder had given him back his will to fight, and he'd be damned if he'd let Dutch Morrison or anyone else take that away. The morning after Dutch's visit, Jebediah decided to expand his understanding of the property. He'd been so focused on the well that he hadn't fully explored the rest of the 40 acres. Now, with Dutch's threats about disputed boundaries echoing in his mind, he needed to know exactly what he owned and where his property lines ran. He started by walking the perimeter, using landmarks from the crude map Earl Hutchins had provided. The boundaries were clearer than he'd expected. A natural wash marked the eastern edge, an old survey stake still stood at the northwest corner, and someone had piled stones along part of the southern line. As he walked, Cinder following at her usual distance, he paid attention to the ground beneath his feet. The fire had been thorough, but here and there he found remnants of what had been here before. A piece of rusted chain, the frame of what might have been a gate, and, most intriguingly, the outline of a foundation, stones mortared together in a rough rectangle about 20 feet by 15 feet. The Muller family's home, or what was left of it. Jebediah knelt beside the foundation, running his hands over the stones. Good work, careful work. These people had intended to stay. He began clearing away ash and debris, more out of respect than necessity, and his fingers touched something smooth and metallic. He dug it out carefully, A brass compass, tarnished but intact, with a hinged cover that still opened properly. Inside the cover, engraved in neat script, H. Mueller, Surveyor, 1867. Heinrich Mueller had been a surveyor. That explained the quality of the well construction, the precise placement of the property markers. This wasn't a man guessing at boundaries. He'd known exactly where his land began and ended. Jebediah cleaned the compass carefully, watching the needle swing to magnetic north. The brass was fine quality, the mechanism still accurate. This was a professional tool, and it gave him an idea. If Mueller had been a surveyor, his property lines would have been officially recorded. More than that, if Dutch tried to claim the fire had changed boundaries or made old surveys invalid, Jebediah could prove him wrong with proper documentation. He needed to go to the county seat. The journey would take 2 days each way, 4 days total away from the property. 4 days Cinder would be alone. 4 days Dutch could do whatever he wanted without witnesses. But if Jebediah didn't secure his legal standing, Dutch would use the courts to take what he couldn't take by intimidation. He looked at Cinder, who was watching him with her usual alert expression. "I have to leave for a few days. Go make sure our claim is solid. Can you hold down the place while I'm gone?" She flicked her ears, but didn't seem concerned. She'd survived months alone before he arrived. A few days wouldn't change anything for her. Jebediah packed light just essentials and the deed to his property. He left Cinder plenty of water and the last of the oats, though she had her own ways of finding food. At dawn the next morning, he set out on foot toward the county seat, a town called Socorro Springs that served as the administrative center for the region. The walk gave him time to think about how much had changed in 3 weeks. He'd arrived in Bitter Springs with $47 and no purpose. Now he had land, water, a partnership with a stubborn donkey, and enemies who wanted to take it all away. Sarah would have called it progress, though not the kind anyone hopes for. Socorro Springs was bigger than Bitter Springs, maybe 800 people, with proper civic buildings including a courthouse and land office. Jebediah arrived late on the second day, dusty and tired, and found a cheap boarding house where 2 bits bought him a bed and breakfast. The land office opened at 8. Jebediah was waiting at the door when the clerk arrived, a woman in her 60s, with steel-grey hair pinned up severely and eyes that had seen every kind of land dispute imaginable. "Help you?" she asked, unlocking the door. "Need to verify some property boundaries. Check if my deed is properly recorded. Name? Jebediah Stone. Property northwest of Bitter Springs, 40 acres that used to belong to the Mueller family." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "The burned land?" Thought the bank finally unloaded that. "Come in." Inside, the office was cramped but meticulously organized. Shelves lined every wall, filled with ledgers and document boxes, each labeled with dates and property descriptions. The woman, her nameplate read, Agnes Porter, county clerk, pulled down several volumes and spread them on her desk. "Mueller property," she said, running her finger down columns of entries. "Here we are. Heinrich and Greta Mueller filed claim 1867, surveyed and recorded that same year. 40 acres, specific coordinates listed." She looked up at Jebediah. "Your deed legitimate?" He handed it to her. She examined it thoroughly, comparing it to the records. After several minutes, she nodded. "Deed's good. Bank had proper authority to sell. You bought it fairly. Property lines are exactly as surveyed in 1867. Fire doesn't change legally recorded boundaries, regardless of what some folks might claim." She looked at him sharply. "Dutch Morrison giving you trouble?" "How'd you know?" "Because Dutch Morrison gives everyone with land. He wants trouble. He's smart about it too. Uses legal pressure, not violence. Files, objections, claims irregularities, ties people up in court until they can't afford to fight anymore." She closed the ledger. "You're luckier than most. Mueller was a professional surveyor. His records are impeccable. Dutch would have a hard time challenging anything here. Is there anything I should do to make my claim stronger?" Agnes thought for a moment. You found water on the property? A well was hidden by brush that burned away in the fire. Then file a water rights claim. Makes your ownership more concrete, establishes you're making productive use of the land. I can process the paperwork today if you have specifics. Jebediah provided everything he knew about the well, its location, depth, the fact that it had been constructed in 1867 by the original owner. Agnes filled out the necessary forms with practiced efficiency, had him sign 3 different documents and stamp them with her official seal. Water rights are now registered under your name, Jebediah Stone. Primary rights to the well and reasonable use of any water source on your 40 acres. She handed him a certified copy. Keep this safe. It's worth more than the land itself out here. What do I owe you? $2 for the filing fee. And a piece of advice for free: Dutch Morrison doesn't lose gracefully. You've just made yourself very visible to the territorial government. He can't make you disappear quietly now, but that doesn't mean he won't try to make your life difficult. Jebediah paid the fee and left with his certified documents carefully stored in his shirt pocket. The return journey seemed shorter, though his legs disagreed. He pushed hard, anxious to get back to the property, to Cinder, to make sure everything was still standing. He crested the ridge overlooking his land in the late afternoon of the 4th day. From this distance, everything looked normal: the well, the foundation, the scorched earth slowly recovering. But as he got closer, he noticed things were different. Fresh hoofprints everywhere, wagon tracks leading right up to the well, boot prints circling the foundation. Cinder was agitated when he arrived, braying and pacing. She pushed against him, clearly upset. Jebediah checked her over quickly. No injuries, but she'd been stressed by something. Nothing was stolen or damaged, but someone had definitely been there. They'd examined the well closely. The rope was repositioned differently than he'd left it. They'd poked around the foundation. They'd surveyed his entire property, measuring it, evaluating it. Then he saw the note. Someone had driven a nail into the mesquite stump that anchored the well rope. Pinned to that nail was a piece of paper with writing that hadn't been weathered by time. Last chance, $300. Otherwise, accidents happen. Fire, drought, cave-ins, all natural causes out here. Jebediah stood holding the note, anger rising hot in his chest, not just at the threat, but at the violation. Dutch's men had come while he was gone, had invaded this space, had frightened Cinder, had made it clear they could come back any time. He looked at his certified water rights document, then at the threatening note. Legal protections were fine, but they didn't stop men from acting in the dark. He couldn't be here every moment, couldn't defend the property alone around the clock. Cinder pushed her nose against his arm, seeking comfort or offering it, he wasn't sure which. I know, girl, I know. He stroked her neck, thinking hard. We need help, can't do this alone anymore. The sun was setting, painting the scorched earth in shades of orange and red. Jebediah made his decision. Tomorrow, he'd go back to Bitter Springs, not to negotiate with Dutch, but to find allies. Because if Dutch wanted a fight, Jebediah would give him one. But he'd be smart about it, the way Sarah had taught him to be smart about challenges that couldn't be met with just stubbornness and hard work. He'd build a community, just like he was building a life on this scorched ground. One careful step at a time. Jebediah arrived in Bitter Springs mid-morning, his mind made up, but uncertain about how to proceed. He needed help, but asking for it didn't come naturally. 3 years of drifting alone had reinforced old habits of self-reliance that Sarah had spent 3 decades trying to soften. Molly's store was busy, 2 women examining fabric, a rancher collecting supplies. Molly saw Jebediah enter and gave him a quick nod that said she'd make time when she could. He waited, watching the commerce of a small town, the familiar rhythms of people going about their lives. When the store finally emptied, Molly came around the counter. You look troubled. Dutch visited my property while I was in Socorro Springs. Left a note, $300 or accidents happen. Molly's expression darkened. That's his way. Threatened just enough to scare people, but vague enough he can't be prosecuted. She was quiet for a moment. You're not the first person he's done this to. I know. That's why I'm here. I need help, Molly. Can't defend the property alone. She studied him, then made a decision. Wait here. She disappeared into the back of the store, and Jebediah heard low conversation. When she returned, 3 men followed her. The first was maybe 40, with carpenter's hands and a scar across his left cheek. Marcus Webb, he introduced himself, used to own 60 acres south of here, had a small lumber operation. Dutch wanted it. I said no. My sawmill burned down 3 months later. No proof it was arson, but we both know what happened. The second man was older, Chinese, with alert eyes and careful posture. Samuel Chen came here 6 years ago, found a promising silver claim, filed proper papers. Dutch claimed I'd missed a boundary marker, got a judge to invalidate my claim. The judge was Dutch's brother-in-law, visiting from Denver. The third man was younger, maybe 35, with the lean build of someone who lived outdoors. His features spoke of mixed heritage, angular cheekbones, and dark eyes that missed nothing. James, Running Bear. My mother was Pawnee, father was a trapper. Had land near the river, good grazing. Dutch claimed water rights superseded my ownership, ran me off with 6 hired guns. The 4 men stood in a rough circle, each carrying the weight of losses to the same man. We've been waiting, Marcus said, waiting for someone with a legitimate claim strong enough to fight Dutch, someone with spine enough to actually do it. Why me? Jebediah asked. Because you have what Dutch wants most, water, Samuel said. With the railroad coming through in 6 months, whoever controls water sources controls everything. Dutch has been systematically acquiring properties to create a monopoly. Your land is the keystone. James nodded. Railroad surveyors have already been through. The most direct route needs a water stop exactly where your property sits. Dutch plan to control that, charge premium rates. But you own it now, and you won't sell. We help you keep it, Marcus said, and we all benefit. It proves Dutch can be beaten, sets a precedent. Maybe some of us even get our property back through legal challenges. Molly spoke up. I'll support this however I can. Tom would have wanted me to. Jebediah looked at each of them, men who'd lost to Dutch Morrison, who carried their own burdens of defeat and anger, men willing to risk Dutch's retaliation by helping someone else fight back. What are you proposing? He asked. We fortify your property, Marcus said. Build structures, establish permanent residence. Hard to run a man off land he's obviously living on and working. I'm a carpenter, I can build. I'll handle the legal side, Samuel offered. File additional claims, research precedents, make sure everything you do is documented and defensible in court. I'll track Dutch's men, James said. Give you warning if they're coming. My grandfather taught me to move through country without being seen. Dutch's hired guns won't know I'm watching them. It was more than Jebediah had hoped for. I can't pay you. Don't need payment, Marcus said. Need purpose. Need to stand up to Dutch Morrison. That's payment enough. They worked out the details over the next hour. Marcus and James would come out to the property tomorrow with supplies and tools. They'd start by building a cabin on the foundation, prove permanent occupancy. Samuel would stay in town, working the legal angles and keeping watch on Dutch's activities. Molly would serve as their connection point and supply base. The next morning, Jebediah led Marcus and James to his land. Cinder greeted them with initial suspicion, but relaxed when she sensed they were friends. Marcus walked the foundation, taking measurements, planning the structure. James surveyed the surrounding territory, noting sight lines and approach routes. Good defensive position, James observed. Long lines of sight, hard to approach unseen. Your donkey's better than a watchdog. They spent the next week building. Marcus proved to be a master craftsman, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He taught Jebediah proper joinery, how to set posts that would last decades. James helped with the heavy work while simultaneously mapping the area, noting every trail and landmark. Cinder became part of the crew. She learned to stand where needed for counterweight, to alert them to approaching riders while they worked. She developed a particular bray for strangers that was different from her greeting sounds. The cabin took shape slowly but surely: 4 walls, a solid roof, a door that fit properly. Nothing fancy, but substantial. Proof that someone lived here, tended this ground, had rights worth defending. On the 5th night, they sat around a small campfire, eating a simple meal Marcus had prepared. The stars were brilliant overhead, the desert air cool and clean. "This reminds me of building my sawmill," Marcus said quietly. "Had 3 good men helping me. We worked for 2 months straight, from dawn until we couldn't see. Best summer of my life, building something that mattered." "Why didn't you rebuild after the fire?" Jebediah asked. "Lost heart," Marcus admitted. "Losing the mill was losing my purpose. I'm a carpenter with nothing to build. Helping you this gives me back something I didn't know I was missing." James poked at the fire with a stick. "My grandfather used to say that land remembers who cares for it. The ground here knows you care, Jebediah. Knows you, and that donkey refused to give up on it. That matters more than deeds or water rights." "Mueller family cared for it too," Jebediah said. "Built that well with love and skill. They're part of this land still, even though they're gone." Samuel, who'd ridden out to check on their progress, spoke up. "Filed 3 additional claims today. Documented water testing results, establishment of permanent residence, historical survey records. Every piece of paper makes Dutch's position weaker." They were quiet for a while, each man lost in his own thoughts. Then Marcus asked the question that had probably been on all their minds. "Tell us about her. The woman in the photograph I saw in your saddlebag." Jebediah took a breath. He hadn't talked about Sarah with anyone since she died, not really talked, not the way you share someone you loved with people who might understand. "Her name was Sarah. We were married 32 years. She died 3 years ago from fever." He paused, finding the words. "She believed in helping people, in standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. When I bought this land, I thought I'd made a fool's mistake. But Sarah would have understood. She'd have seen the possibility here, same way that Donkey did." "She sounds like she was something special," James said. "She was." Jebediah smiled, and it didn't hurt the way it usually did. "She'd have liked you fellas. Would have fed you better than we're eating tonight, though." They laughed, and the conversation moved on to other things: plans for the cabin, stories from their different lives, the kind of talk men share when they're building something together. When Jebediah lay down that night, Cinder nearby and his new friends sleeping around the banked fire, he realized something had shifted. He'd spoken about Sarah, and it hadn't been only painful. There'd been gratitude there too, and the ability to share her with others. He was healing. The scorched earth was healing. And maybe that's what this place was meant to be, not just a property or a water source, but a place where broken things could mend. Morning came with the sound of hammering Marcus already at work, building their future 1 board at a time. 3 weeks after Marcus and James arrived, the property had transformed. The cabin stood solid and weatherproof on the old foundation, a testament to Marcus's skill and their collective determination. A small storage shed held tools and supplies. The well area had been improved with proper stonework around the opening and a permanent shelter to protect the pulley system from weather. The scorched earth itself was showing the first signs of recovery, small patches of hardy grass appearing where water had been spilled, a few brave wildflowers emerging from seeds that had waited years for the right conditions. Jebediah, Marcus, and James had settled into a comfortable routine. They worked together, ate together, kept watch together. Cinder had accepted both men completely, greeting them each morning with her particular mixture of enthusiasm and dignity. Even Samuel made regular visits from town, always bringing news and legal documents that strengthened their position. It was during excavation for the storage shed that they made the discovery. Marcus had been digging the foundation when his shovel struck something solid about 2 feet down. Not stone, the sound was different. He cleared the soil carefully, revealing a corner of rusted metal. "Jebediah," he called. "Found something." They worked together to uncover it, a metal box, maybe 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 6 inches deep. It was sealed with a hasp and padlock that had rusted through decades of exposure to moisture in the soil. James broke the lock with a hammer and chisel. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had partially deteriorated, was a leather-bound journal. Jebediah lifted it out carefully. The leather was water-stained but intact, the pages inside mostly preserved by the oilcloth and the metal box. On the cover, embossed in fading gold, H. Muller Survey Records 1867 to 1868. "This belonged to the man who built the well," Jebediah said quietly. "The surveyor." They took the journal into the cabin where the light was better. Jebediah opened it carefully, mindful of the aged paper. The first page contained neat handwriting in German script, but much of the journal was in English: maps, measurements, technical notes about water sources and geological formations. Mueller had been thorough, obsessively thorough. Page after page detailed his survey of the region, his analysis of water sources, his theories about underground aquifers. The maps were beautifully drawn, precise and detailed, showing not just surface features, but Mueller's educated guesses about what lay beneath. "This is remarkable," Samuel said when he arrived that evening and saw the journal. "Professional-grade survey work. These maps would have taken months to create." They spread the most detailed maps across the cabin's table, studying them by lamplight. Mueller had identified multiple water sources in the region, but one feature dominated his attention: a massive underground aquifer that he believed extended for miles beneath the surface. "Look at this." Samuel pointed to a series of notations. "He's mapped the aquifer's extent. It runs beneath your 40 acres, Jebediah, but it doesn't stop there. According to his calculations, it extends west and south under several other properties." Marcus leaned closer, following Mueller's careful lines. "That's Dutch Morrison's ranch. The aquifer runs right under his land." They were quiet, understanding settling over them like a cold weight. "Dutch knows," James said. "Has to know. That's why he wants this property so desperately." Jebediah turned the pages carefully, looking for more information. Near the middle of the journal, the entries shifted from technical notes to something more personal. Mueller's handwriting became less careful, more hurried. "August 12, 1868. My neighbor Morrison has been asking questions about my surveys, wants to know if I've found anything valuable beneath the ground. I have deflected his inquiries, but his interest is troubling. The 20th of August, 1868, Morrison offered to buy my property today. His offer was generous, too generous. He knows something. I suspect he has seen my preliminary maps when I filed them with the territorial office. Must be more careful." The 3rd of September, 1868, Morrison's questions have become demands. He claims he has rights to any water sources that extend beneath his property. I have explained that my well accesses the aquifer from my land through my labor. He was not pleased. The 8th of September, 1868. Strange men have been seen near my property. Morrison's hired hands, I think. Greta is frightened. I have hidden my most detailed surveys in case something happens. Will file official claim with territorial government next week. The final entry was dated the 14th of September, 1868. Fire broke out last night. Wind carried it across the property with unnatural speed. We barely escaped with our lives. Everything is lost: home, barn, equipment. Greta is beside herself. The children are terrified. We must leave. Morrison watched us go. I saw him on the ridge, silhouetted against the flames. I have no proof, but I know in my heart this was no accident. May God forgive him, for I cannot. The entry ended there. No more pages. Mueller and his family had fled, never to return. Jebediah closed the journal carefully, his hands shaking slightly. Dutch Morrison set that fire. He drove the Muellers away to get access to the aquifer. And failed, Marcus said, because they abandoned the property and it reverted to the bank. Dutch couldn't claim it without raising suspicions. But he's been waiting, Samuel said slowly, waiting for someone else to buy it, someone he could pressure or buy out, someone who wouldn't know about the aquifer. Someone like me, Jebediah said. They sat in silence, the implications settling over them. This wasn't just about one man's land or one well. Dutch Morrison had been planning a water monopoly for 20 years. With the railroad coming, control of the aquifer would mean control of every ranch, every town, every settlement in the region. He could charge whatever he wanted for water access, could make or break anyone who depended on it. Mueller filed preliminary maps with the territorial office, Samuel said, his legal mind working through the implications. If we can find those records, they predate any claims Dutch has made. We could file for primary rights to the aquifer based on Mueller's original survey work. Would that hold up? Marcus asked. If we can prove continuous connection between Mueller's claim and Jebediah's current ownership, yes. The property transferred legally through the bank. Mueller never formally abandoned his claim. He was driven off by what we can now demonstrate was arson. James had been quiet, but now he spoke. If we do this, Dutch will know we've found the journal, found proof of what he did. He won't just threaten anymore. No, Jebediah agreed. He'll come with everything he has. They looked at each other, 4 men who'd already lost to Dutch Morrison in one way or another, now facing the decision to challenge him on a scale that dwarfed their individual grievances. We have to do it, Marcus said finally. Not just for us, for every person Dutch has bullied or cheated, for the Muellers who lost everything, for everyone who'll need water in the future. Agreed, James said. Samuel nodded. I'll need to ride to Santa Fe with the journal, file claims with the Territorial Water Commission, get this on record before Dutch realizes what we've found. That's a 3-day journey, Jebediah said. One way. I'll go with him, Marcus offered. Watch his back. And I'll stay here with Jebediah, James said. Guard the property and that donkey. If Dutch's men come, they'll find we're not as easy to move as they think. They spent the next hours planning. Samuel would make copies of the most important maps and entries in case something happened to the original journal. They'd leave at first light, riding fast, carrying proof that could change everything. Jebediah went outside to check on Cinder. She was standing near the well, alert despite the late hour, as if she sensed the importance of what they'd discovered. You knew this land was special, he told her softly, knew it was worth fighting for. You were right to stay, right to dig until you found that well. Now we know why it matters so much. She pushed her nose against his chest, a gesture of affection or reassurance, he wasn't sure which, maybe both. He thought about the Muellers, Heinrich and Greta, and their children, fleeing through the night while flames consumed everything they'd built, thought about Dutch Morrison watching them go, satisfied that he'd driven them off, thought about 20 years of Dutch using fear and violence to get what he wanted. That ended now. Sarah's voice was in his head again, clear as if she were standing beside him. Standing up is hard, but living with yourself after backing down is harder. I know, he said aloud. I know. Cinder flicked her ears, listening to him talk to someone who wasn't there, accepting it the way she accepted everything else about this strange man who'd bought scorched land and decided to stay. Inside the cabin, lamplight flickered as Samuel carefully copied maps and Marcus prepared supplies for their journey. James was cleaning weapons, not looking for a fight, but ready for one if it came. They were 4 men and a donkey against the most powerful rancher in the territory. 4 men with a journal of proof and a claim to water that could change everything. 4 men who'd been knocked down before and learned that getting back up was the only choice that mattered. The stakes had just become enormous, but so had the possibility of winning. Samuel and Marcus left at dawn, Mueller's journal wrapped carefully in oilcloth and secured in Samuel's saddlebag. They rode good horses borrowed from Molly, not the fastest animals, but reliable over distance. Jebediah and James watched them disappear into the morning haze. both men understanding that the next few days would determine everything. "We should prepare for company," James said quietly. "Dutch has men watching the roads. They'll know Samuel and Marcus left, and they'll wonder why. How long before Dutch figures out what we found? He's not stupid. 2 men riding hard towards Santa Fe right after we've been excavating? He'll make the connection." James scanned the horizon with practiced eyes. "I'll set up observation posts. If anyone approaches, we'll have warning." The 3-day journey to Santa Fe tested Samuel and Marcus in ways they hadn't anticipated. The first day passed without incident, but on the second day, they noticed riders following at a distance 3 men who maintained just enough separation to avoid direct confrontation, but made their presence felt. "Dutch's men," Marcus said, checking the rifle secured to his saddle. "Don't engage unless they force it," Samuel cautioned. "We need to reach Santa Fe with this journal intact." That night, they made a cold camp, no fire to mark their position. They took turns keeping watch, but the followers didn't approach. Instead, they remained visible on a distant ridge, a psychological tactic designed to create fear and exhaustion. Santa Fe appeared on the afternoon of the 3rd day, its adobe buildings golden in the slanting light. Samuel went straight to the territorial offices, while Marcus stayed with the horses and kept watch. The followers had disappeared somewhere in the outskirts of the city, but Marcus didn't trust their absence. Inside the territorial building, Samuel found himself directed to the office of Thomas Blackwell, Commissioner of Water Rights for New Mexico Territory. Blackwell was in his 50s, with the careful eyes of a man who'd spent decades navigating political waters as treacherous as any physical drought. "I need to file aquifer rights claims," Samuel said without preamble, "and I have historical survey documentation that predates all existing claims in the Bitter Springs region." Blackwell's eyebrows rose. "That's a bold statement. Let me see your documentation." Samuel laid Mueller's journal on the desk, opening it to the detailed aquifer maps. Blackwell leaned forward, his professional interest clearly piqued. He studied the maps for several minutes, occasionally making notes, comparing details to other documents on his desk. "This is professional-grade survey work," Blackwell said finally. "Where did you get this?" "Heinrich Mueller's original survey journal. He was a professional surveyor who claimed land near Bitter Springs in 1867. Filed preliminary maps with this office that same year. The property was abandoned after a suspicious fire in 1868. "Mueller," Blackwell repeated, reaching for a different set of ledgers. He flipped through pages, found what he was looking for. "Yes, here. Heinrich Mueller, filed survey maps, September 1867, recorded with territorial government. Preliminary aquifer identification noted but not fully claimed at the time." He looked up at Samuel. "These claims were never formally abandoned or transferred. They just went dormant when Mueller left. The property has been legally purchased by Jebediah Stone, who discovered Mueller's well and has been developing water rights. Can Stone claim continuation of Mueller's original survey work?" Blackwell thought carefully. "If Stone owns the property legally, and Mueller's heirs haven't contested the transfer, then yes. Stone can file primary aquifer rights based on Mueller's original identification and survey work. That would predate any subsequent claims. Dutch Morrison has been filing water source claims throughout the region for the past 15 years. "Ah." Blackwell's expression became knowing. "This is about Morrison. I've seen his filings. Very aggressive, very comprehensive. But if Mueller identified this aquifer first and filed preliminary maps, Morrison's claims become secondary. That's exactly what we need to establish." Blackwell worked through the paperwork with methodical precision. He cross-referenced Mueller's maps with current property records, verified Stone's deed, confirmed the chain of ownership from Mueller through the bank to Stone. After 2 hours of careful documentation, he prepared the official certificate. Primary water rights to the identified aquifer based on Heinrich Mueller's 1867 survey and continued through legal transfer to current property owner Jebediah Stone. This supersedes all subsequent claims filed by other parties in the affected region. Blackwell stamped the document with his official seal, signed it, and handed it to Samuel. "Keep this safe. Morrison won't be happy." "That's an understatement." "Be careful, Mr. Chen. Morrison has influence, and men with influence don't like losing it. This document is legal protection, but paper can't stop bullets." Samuel secured the certificate in his jacket, thanked Blackwell, and left to find Marcus. They needed to get back to Bitter Springs before Dutch learned what they'd accomplished. The return journey started well. They rode hard, pushing the horses but not breaking them, trying to put distance between themselves and Santa Fe. But on the second day, as they passed through a narrow canyon with high walls on either side, the ambush came. 3 men appeared ahead, blocking the trail, the same men who'd followed them to Santa Fe. Their intentions were clear in their postures, in the rifles they held casually but ready. "That's far enough," one of them called. "Hand over whatever papers you got from the territorial office." Marcus and Samuel pulled their horses to a stop. Marcus's hand moved slowly toward his rifle. "Don't be stupid," the man warned. 3 of us, 2 of you. Just give us the papers and ride away." "Can't do that," Samuel said calmly. "Then you're choosing the hard way." What happened next occurred in heartbeats. Marcus grabbed his rifle, knowing they couldn't surrender what they'd fought so hard to obtain. The lead gunman fired, his shot catching Marcus in the left shoulder and spinning him partially out of his saddle. Samuel spurred his horse forward, charging the men rather than retreating, using surprise as a weapon. His horse collided with one of the gunman's mounts, creating chaos. Marcus, despite his wound, got his rifle up and fired twice. One shot went wild, but the second caught a gunman in the leg. The man screamed and fell. Samuel drew his pistol and fired at the remaining 2 men, more to create covering fire than to hit anything. The ambushers hadn't expected resistance. They'd thought intimidation would work. Now, with 1 man wounded and 2 armed men fighting back, they reconsidered. The uninjured gunmen grabbed their wounded companion and retreated, dragging him toward their horses. Marcus slumped in his saddle, blood spreading across his shirt. Samuel reached him quickly. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Marcus gasped. "But I'll live. Go." They rode hard through the rest of the day, Marcus grimacing with every jolt but refusing to stop. Samuel fashioned a rough bandage from his shirt, but Marcus needed proper medical attention. By the time they reached Bitter Springs at dawn of the 3rd day, Marcus was pale and sweating, barely staying in his saddle. Molly saw them coming and immediately took charge, getting Marcus to the town's doctor while Samuel collapsed in her store, exhausted but clutching the certificate that had cost them so much. "James arrived an hour ago," Molly said when she returned from the doctor's. "Dutch and 8 men rode out to Jebediah's property yesterday. James came to get help." Samuel felt ice in his stomach. "Jebediah's alone." "Not anymore. James has been gathering every man willing to stand up to Dutch. They're assembling now." Samuel pushed himself to his feet despite exhaustion. "Then we need to move." Within the hour, 12 men had gathered, townsmen, ranchers, former soldiers, men tired of Dutch Morrison's control over the region. James had done more than gather men. He'd given them a reason to risk Dutch's wrath. Word of the aquifer claims, of Mueller's journal, of proof that Dutch had been building his monopoly through intimidation and probable arson. It had spread quickly through whispered conversations. Samuel showed them the territorial certificate, official and undeniable. "This is legal. Jebediah Stone has primary water rights. Dutch Morrison's claims are secondary. Anyone who harms Stone or his property is interfering with territorial water rights." A murmur went through the group. Legal backing changed everything. This wasn't just rebellion, it was enforcement of legitimate law. They armed themselves, not looking for a gunfight, but prepared if Dutch forced one. They gathered supplies, evidence, copies of the critical documents. Samuel insisted on going despite his exhaustion. This fight had been 20 years in the making, and he wouldn't miss the end. The sun was climbing toward noon when they rode out. 12 men and Molly she'd insisted on coming. Said her husband Tom would have ridden with them if he'd been alive. They made good time across the desert, following the trail Jebediah had walked that first day with $47 and no hope. As they crested the ridge overlooking his property, they saw smoke. The cabin was burning. Orange flames climbed the walls Marcus had built with such care, consuming in minutes what had taken weeks to construct. Black smoke rose into the clear sky like a signal of destruction. Below, they could see figures Dutch Morrison and his men, 8 strong, standing around the property. One of the men was holding a torch. Near the well, in a makeshift pen built from rope and stakes, Cinder stood trapped, agitated, braying loudly in distress. Jebediah was nowhere visible. Samuel felt his heart drop. They'd come to help, but had they come too late? Then he saw movement near the well. Jebediah emerged from behind the stone shelter they'd built around the opening. He was armed with Tom Brennan's revolver, but he was alone, facing 8 men who worked for a man who'd already proven willing to burn property and drive off families. "We need to move now," James said quietly, his hand on his rifle. The 12 men checked their weapons, shared quick glances that communicated everything: fear, determination, the knowledge that this moment would define them. Then they rode down the slope toward the burning cabin, toward the confrontation 20 years overdue, toward the reckoning that would determine not just one man's land, but the future of everyone who called this harsh, beautiful country home. The smoke from the burning cabin rose higher, a signal visible for miles, a declaration that Dutch Morrison was done with subtle threats and legal maneuvering. But so was everyone else. Jebediah walked forward slowly, deliberately, his boots crunching on the scorched earth that had given him everything he now stood to defend. Behind him, the well stood intact. Dutch's men had tried to damage it, but the stone construction had defeated their efforts. The cabin blazed, sending sparks into the afternoon sky. But the well remained. The water remained. That's what mattered. Dutch Morrison stood surrounded by his hired men, confident in his numbers, in his power, in his certainty that this would end as everything else had ended with him getting what he wanted. He watched Jebediah approach with an expression somewhere between contempt and satisfaction. "Stone," Dutch called out, "you've made this harder than it needed to be, but it ends here. Sign over the deed, take whatever money you think is fair, and walk away, or we'll bury you on your own land." Jebediah stopped 20 feet away, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to have room to move if shooting started. He pulled a folded document from inside his shirt, the territorial certificate Samuel had risked everything to obtain. "This is a territorial water rights certificate," Jebediah said, his voice carrying across the open ground. "Primary aquifer rights based on Heinrich Müller's 1867 survey, filed 3 days ago in Santa Fe with Commissioner Thomas Blackwell. It supersedes all subsequent claims, including yours, Dutch." Dutch's expression flickered surprise, then calculation, then rage. "That's impossible. Müller's claims were abandoned. They were dormant, not abandoned. And they're active again now, legally transferred through my ownership of this property." Jebediah raised the document higher so Dutch's men could see it. "Anyone who harms me or my property is now interfering with territorial water rights. That's a federal offense." Several of Dutch's men shifted uncomfortably. They'd signed on for intimidation, maybe some property damage, but interfering with territorial claims was different. That could bring federal marshals, real consequences that Dutch's money and influence couldn't make disappear. "He's bluffing," Dutch said, but his voice carried less certainty. "That paper doesn't mean anything out here." "It means everything," Jebediah replied. "You know it does. Your whole plan was to control the aquifer before anyone else knew it existed. But Müller knew. He surveyed it, mapped it, filed preliminary claims 20 years ago, and you drove him off with fire to get access to it. You can't prove that. Müller's journal proves it. Every word of his suspicions about you, every detail of how the fire started, every observation about your interest in his water surveys, it's all recorded. All filed now with the territorial government. Dutch's jaw clenched. Jebediah could see the man's mind working, trying to find an angle, a way to still win this. But the hired guns around him were already backing away, slightly professional fighters who understood when odds shifted from acceptable risk to probable disaster. One of them spoke up. "Morrison, I didn't sign on for federal charges. Man's got legal claims, documented and registered." "Shut up," Dutch snapped. "No, sir," the man said. "I'm done." He moved toward his horse, and two other men followed him. Dutch's control was cracking. Jebediah could see it in his posture, in the tightness around his eyes, in the way his hands clenched and unclenched. 20 years of planning, of carefully building a monopoly through intimidation and legal manipulation, collapsing because one stubborn man and a donkey had refused to quit. "This isn't over," Dutch said, his voice shaking with rage. "You think one piece of paper protects you? You think those claims make you safe? I think the law protects me, and the 12 armed men riding down that ridge behind you." Dutch spun around. Coming down the slope, spread out in a line, were James, Samuel, Molly, and 9 others from Bitter Springs. They rode slowly but with clear purpose, weapons visible but not yet drawn, a community standing together. Dutch's remaining men saw them coming, calculated quickly, and began moving toward their horses. The mathematics of the situation had shifted dramatically. They'd been 8 against 1, but now they were 5 against 13, and most of those 13 looked like they knew how to use the weapons they carried. "You're all making a mistake," Dutch said. But even he could hear the hollow sound of his words. "The only mistake," Jebediah said quietly, "was yours. 20 years ago when you set that fire, when you decided power was worth more than people." Dutch's face went red. His hand dropped to the revolver at his hip, rage overwhelming judgment. "I'll kill you myself." He drew his weapon, lifting it toward Jebediah. But before he could fire, there was a sharp crack of breaking wood and rope. The makeshift pen holding Cinder collapsed as she threw her weight against it one final time. The worn rope halter James had fashioned for her snapped clean through. Cinder charged. 800 pounds of furious donkey crossed the 20 feet between her and Dutch Morrison in heartbeats. Dutch saw her coming, tried to swing his revolver toward her, but she was too close, too fast, too determined. She hit him squarely in the chest with her shoulder, and Dutch went down hard, his revolver flying from his hand to land in the ash and dirt. His remaining men froze, unsure whether to help their employer or save themselves. The decision was made for them as Jebediah's allies arrived, surrounding the scene, rifles ready but not aimed, yet a show of force that needed no violent action to make its point. Samuel dismounted, holding papers. "Dutch Morrison, you're under arrest for arson, intimidation, and interference with territorial water rights. The county sheriff is on his way. We sent word yesterday." As if summoned by his name, Sheriff Crawford appeared from the direction of Bitter Springs, riding hard with 2 deputies. He took in the scene, the burning cabin, the scattered hired guns, Dutch Morrison on the ground with a donkey standing over him like some kind of avenging angel, and Jebediah Stone holding a territorial certificate that changed everything. "Well," the sheriff said, dismounting, "looks like we've got this sorted. Morrison, you're coming with me." The immediate chaos settled like dust after a storm. Dutch's hired guns, who hadn't already fled, quickly made themselves scarce. Once the sheriff arrived, professional fighters smart enough to know when a job had gone bad. Dutch himself sat in the dirt where Cinder had knocked him, breathing hard, his expensive clothes covered in ash and soil. His empire of intimidation collapsed around him. Jebediah went straight to Cinder. She was breathing hard from her charge, sides heaving, but her eyes were alert and focused. He ran his hands over her, checking for injuries, finding nothing but some scrapes on her shoulders where she'd broken through the pen. "You saved me," he said softly, stroking her dusty neck, Again. That's twice now you've given me back my life. She pushed her nose against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her neck, the two of them standing together in the center of scorched earth that had somehow become home. Sheriff Crawford secured Dutch with iron shackles, reading charges that ranged from arson to attempted murder. There'll be a trial, the sheriff said. Federal charges for the water rights interference, territorial charges for the rest. You'll need to testify, Stone. I'll be there, Jebediah said. As the sheriff led Dutch away, the man who'd terrorized the region for 20 years looked diminished, smaller somehow, his power revealed as nothing more than fear and money, both of which had limits when faced with people willing to stand together. Marcus arrived in a wagon from town, his shoulder bandaged, but his spirit intact despite the pain. "Told you I wouldn't miss the end," he said, wincing as he climbed down, though Cinder handled the final blow better than I could have. The cabin was still burning, but James and several others were already organizing a bucket brigade from the well. It took an hour to extinguish the flames completely, leaving behind a skeleton of charred beams and the stone foundation that had survived fire once before and would survive it again. Jebediah stood looking at the destruction, and Samuel came to stand beside him. "We'll rebuild," Samuel said, "stronger this time." "We will." Jebediah turned to face the group of people who'd ridden out to help him, neighbors, townspeople, men who'd lost to Dutch themselves and had finally found a way to win. "But first, I need to say something." They gathered around, 12 people and one sheriff who'd stayed to hear what came next. "This water," Jebediah began, gesturing toward the well, "it belongs to all of us. Not legally, it's mine through Muller's claims and my ownership, but morally, spiritually, it's ours. Muller found it and shared it. Dutch tried to hoard it. I won't make that mistake." He pulled out the territorial certificate, held it so everyone could see. "I'm granting shared access to anyone who helped today. More than that, any local rancher or farmer who needs water gets it at cost. We'll charge fair rates to freight companies and travelers, but this community gets taken care of first." Molly's eyes glistened. "Tom would have loved this, would have loved you." "Tom's revolver saved my life," Jebediah said. "His widow gave me a chance when no one else would. His tools built what Dutch tried to burn. This is Tom's legacy as much as mine." James stepped forward. "We should make this formal. Create a water cooperative, something legal that outlasts any one of us." "I'll draft the paperwork," Samuel offered. "Make it binding, make it fair, make it permanent." Over the next week, the property transformed through collective effort. Marcus, despite his healing shoulder, supervised the reconstruction of the cabin this time, with stone walls that wouldn't burn, with a proper foundation, with craftsmanship that spoke of permanence. James helped build a barn for Cinder, and the animals that would inevitably follow already, a lame horse and an old mule, had been brought to the property. Animals others had given up on finding a home alongside the donkey who'd refused to quit. Samuel handled the legal work, creating a water cooperative that gave locals guaranteed access while establishing fair rates for commercial use. The papers were filed, stamped, and recorded with the same meticulous care Muller had shown in his original surveys. Jebediah worked alongside everyone, his hands rebuilding what had been destroyed, his mind finally at peace with what he'd found in this unlikely place. In the evenings, he'd sit with Cinder, talking to her the way he'd once talked to Sarah, and finding that he could speak of his late wife now with love and gratitude instead of just grief. One morning he presented Cinder with a new halter he'd commissioned from the town's leather worker. The leather was strong and supple, reinforced with brass fittings that wouldn't break. Attached to the cheekpiece was a small brass plate, engraved with careful lettering, "Cinder, Guardian of the Well." She accepted the halter with what seemed like dignity, standing still while he fitted it, then shaking her head once, as if approving the weight and feel of it. "You earned it," Jebediah told her. "Everything here exists because you refused to give up, because you knew this land was worth saving." The way station began to take shape, a functional stop for travelers, a water source for the community, a symbol of what could be built when people chose cooperation over conflict. The scorched earth that had seemed so dead was showing life now, grass growing where water had been spilled, small trees planted by people who wanted to see them grow, flowers appearing in unlikely places where seeds had waited years for the right conditions. Jebediah Stone had come here with $47 and a worn leather saddlebag, ready to give up on life itself. Now he stood in the center of a growing community, surrounded by friends, partnered with a donkey who'd saved him twice, and responsible for water that would sustain this harsh land for generations to come. He still missed Sarah every day, but the sharp pain of loss had softened into something gentler: gratitude for the years they'd had, appreciation for the values she'd taught him, and recognition that honoring her memory meant living fully, not just existing. 6 months passed, like water flowing steadily from a reliable well, not rushed, not stagnant, but moving forward with purpose and direction. Early spring arrived in the desert, bringing with it a season of renewal that seemed particularly fitting for land that had been written off as dead. The property bore little resemblance to the scorched wasteland Jebediah had first seen. The cabin stood solid and permanent, its stone walls weathered just enough to look like they'd always belonged here. A proper barn housed Cinder and her growing collection of rescue animals. The lame horse had recovered enough to carry light loads, the old mule had found peace in his final years, and a 3-legged dog named Scout had wandered in one day and decided to stay. The way station had become exactly what Jebediah had envisioned, a reliable stop on the freight route, with water, feed, and shelter available for travelers. A hand-painted sign stood at the property's edge, visible from the main trail. Stones, rest, water, feed, welcome. Marcus had crafted the sign with the same care he brought to everything, and the lettering was clear enough to be read from 100 yards. The railroad had indeed come through, just as predicted. Survey crews had marked the route that passed within a mile of Jebediah's property, and construction crews were already laying track. The railroad company had negotiated a contract for water access, fair terms, reasonable rates, guaranteed service. Jebediah's water cooperative model had impressed them. They'd even mentioned it in their reports as an example of community-minded resource management. Marcus had moved his carpentry operation to the property permanently, building a workshop beside the barn. He kept busy with repairs and new construction as the way station expanded. His shoulder had healed well, leaving only a scar and occasional stiffness on cold mornings, badges of standing up for what mattered. James stopped by regularly, though he'd reclaimed his riverland through legal action supported by evidence from Dutch Morrison's trial. Dutch himself was serving 10 years in a territorial prison, his empire of intimidation dismantled piece by piece as other victims came forward with their stories. The trial had been thorough, and the verdict had sent a message: bullying and corruption had limits, even in hard country. Samuel had opened a permanent legal office in Bitter Springs, specializing in water rights and land claims. He'd helped 7 families secure their properties against various challenges, building a reputation for meticulous work and fair dealing. He visited Stone's Rest weekly, always bringing news and usually staying for supper. Molly Brennan had become a regular presence at the property. She and Jebediah had developed a friendship that was slowly, carefully becoming something more. They were both cautious, both carrying the weight of lost spouses, both understanding that new love didn't replace old love, but grew alongside it. She'd stayed for supper twice last week, and Jebediah had found himself hoping she'd stay again tonight. On this particular afternoon, a young couple stopped at the way station, newlyweds by the look of them, heading west to start a ranch with everything they owned packed into a wagon. Their horses drank deeply from the trough, while the husband paid for feed and water. "This is a nice setup," the young man said, looking around at the functional buildings, the well-maintained grounds, the sense of permanence. "How long have you been here?" "About 7 months," Jebediah replied. "Though it feels longer. Good longer, I mean." "You build all this yourself?" Had help, good friends, good timing, and a stubborn donkey who refused to give up. Jebediah gestured toward Cinder, who was grazing near the barn, her brass nameplate catching the afternoon light. The young woman's eyes followed his gesture. That donkey's wearing a brass plate? She earned it. This whole place exists because she knew the land was worth more than people thought, found the well that everyone else had forgotten about. The couple exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that comes with fresh marriage. "We heard a story in Bitter Springs," the wife said, "about a man who bought scorched land for $25 and found fortune." "Fortune's a strong word," Jebediah said gently. "But I found something valuable, yes, water, purpose, community, friends who stand by you, a stubborn donkey who saves your life when you need it most." The young man pulled out coins to pay for the water and feed. "So that $25 turned into a fortune?" Jebediah looked around at what he'd built: the stone cabin, the barn housing animals nobody else wanted, the well providing water for an entire community, the friends who'd risked everything to help him stand against corruption. He thought about Sarah's memory preserved in doing good work, about Cinder grazing peacefully after years of abandonment, about finding purpose after 3 years of drifting. "Not a fortune in dollars," he said finally, "but in everything that matters. Yes, more than I could have imagined that first day." The couple thanked him and continued on their journey west, carrying with them the story of Stone's Rest and the man who'd refused to quit on land everyone else had abandoned. As evening settled over the property, Jebediah sat on the porch of his stone cabin. The day's work was done, travelers served, animals fed, water flowing freely from the well that had changed everything. Cinder approached and rested her head on the porch railing beside him, her usual evening routine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Sarah's wedding band. He'd carried it every day since she died, but lately he'd been thinking about what to do with it. Not selling it, never that, but perhaps it was time to put it somewhere meaningful, somewhere that honored both her memory and his new life. "I met someone," he said aloud to Sarah's memory. "Molly Brennan. She's kind and practical, and she reminds me of you in the ways that matter. I'm not trying to replace you, I could never do that. But I think you'd want me to live, not just exist." The evening breeze moved across the property, rustling the new grass that had grown where scorched earth had been. The sound was peaceful, accepting, like permission granted from someone who'd always wanted his happiness. "I'm going to keep your ring," Jebediah continued, "but I'm going to set it in the cornerstone of the barn, a permanent part of this place, part of the foundation. You'd like that, I think. Your values built into something that helps people and animals who need it." Cinder made a soft sound, not quite a bray, more like acknowledgement or comfort. She understood him in ways that didn't require words, the way all good partnerships worked. Jebediah stood and walked toward the well, Cinder following at his side. The sun was setting over the desert, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Where fire had once destroyed, water now sustained. Where isolation had ruled, community had grown. Where despair had seemed inevitable, hope had taken root. He drew a bucket of cold, clear water and poured some for Cinder, then drank deeply himself. The water tasted sweet and clean, exactly as it had that first day when he'd realized what he'd found. The land around them showed signs of continued recovery. Grass grew thicker each week. Small mesquite trees were pushing up from roots that had survived the fire. Flowers appeared in unexpected places, nature's stubborn insistence on renewal. Even the soil was changing color, from dead black to the rich brown of earth that could sustain life again. Jebediah looked at Cinder, at the brass plate she wore with such dignity, at the property they'd defended and built together. He thought about Mueller's journal and the family who'd loved this land first. Thought about Dutch Morrison learning that power built on fear eventually collapses. Thought about the community that had rallied when one man stood up to injustice. Mostly, he thought about second chances, how land could be reborn, how people could find purpose after loss, how the things the world threw away often held the most value. "Come on, girl," he said to Cinder. "Let's go check on the others before full dark." They walked together toward the barn, where rescue animals waited, creatures like themselves who'd been abandoned or written off, who'd found sanctuary on land that refused to stay dead. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and steady and reliable. Behind them, the well continued its patient work of bringing water from deep underground to the surface where it was needed. The well that had been hidden, then found. The well that had changed everything. Sometimes the things the world throws away hold the most value. Sometimes what looks like a mistake becomes the greatest blessing of your life. And sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms, like a stubborn donkey standing guard over scorched earth, waiting for someone stubborn enough to stay.